Picture this. A cardboard box, soft with age, sitting in the corner of a dusty attic in rural Pennsylvania. Nobody has touched it in decades. The tape on the lid has turned brittle and yellow, and when it finally gives way, a cloud of dust rises into a shaft of afternoon light. Inside, wrapped in a moth-eaten quilt, is a photograph. Just one. Black and white, cracked at the corners, the emulsion peeling like old paint. At first glance, it looks like 100 other Civil War-era photographs sitting in museum archives across the country. Soldiers in wool uniforms, a worn wooden fence, a tree line in the background. Nothing special. But when a team of historians finally sits down to examine it under high-resolution scanning equipment, something in the background makes every single one of them go quiet, then pale, then very, very still. This is the story of that photograph, how it was found, what it might show, and why, more than a century and a half after it was taken, people still can't agree on what they're looking at. Stay with me because this one gets stranger the deeper you go. Our story begins not on a battlefield, but in an estate sale. In the autumn of 2019, a small property outside Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, changed hands for the first time in almost 90 years. The house had belonged to the Whitfield family, a modest farming household whose lineage stretched back to the mid-1800s. When the last surviving Whitfield relative passed away without children, the property and its contents were auctioned off piece by piece. Most of what sold that weekend was unremarkable farm tools, chipped china, a rocking chair with a broken rail, but one lockbox 47, according to the auctioneer's ledger, contained a stack of family papers, letters tied with twine, and a leather photo album with a cracked spine. The box was purchased for $11 by a local collector named Daniel Reyes, a man who spent his weekends combing estate sales for pieces of forgotten history. Reyes wasn't looking for anything extraordinary. He collected old documents the way some people collect coins, quietly, patiently, without any expectation of finding something world-changing. It wasn't until nearly 3 months later, while cataloging the contents of Box 47 for his personal archive, that Reyes noticed something odd. Tucked between 2 pages of the photo album, separated from the rest of the collection, was a single tin-type photograph, wrapped in a handkerchief, and sealed inside a small wax paper envelope. Someone, at some point, had gone out of their way to protect this one image differently from all the others. Curious, Reyes carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a photograph of a group of soldiers standing at the edge of a wooded clearing, rifles at rest, expressions grim. On the back, in faded ink, someone had written a single line. "Do not show this to anyone who was there." No date, no names, no explanation. Reyes said later, in an interview for a regional history podcast, that the inscription sent a chill through him before he even looked closely at the image itself. Why would a family keep a photograph separate from the rest of their collection, sealed, protected, and marked with a warning, unless there was something about it they didn't want forgotten, but also didn't want casually seen? That question is what set the next 4 years of investigation into motion. To understand why that single line of ink felt so unsettling, it helps to understand a little bit about the Whitfield family itself. Census records show the Whitfields had farmed the same stretch of Pennsylvania land since the early 1800s, weathering droughts, market crashes, and of course, the war that tore through their region in the summer of 1863. Like most families in the area, they would have felt the war not as a distant headline, but as something that happened, quite literally, in their fields and fence lines. Gettysburg itself sits close enough that the sound of artillery fire during the battle was reportedly audible from farms miles away. Families who lived through that kind of proximity to war often kept 2 versions of their history. There was the version told openly, the letters read aloud at supper, the medals displayed on mantels, the stories passed down as points of pride. And then there was the quieter version, tucked into drawers and sealed in envelopes, brought out rarely if at all, containing the parts of the war nobody wanted to explain to children or curious neighbors. Reyes came to believe, the more he studied the Whitfield papers, that Box 47 contained a piece of that second, quieter history, not because anyone told him so directly, but because of the care with which it had been preserved. Old houses accumulate clutter, papers get lost, boxes get damp, ink fades past legibility, yet this one photograph, wrapped twice over and marked with a warning, had survived in remarkably good condition for something over a century and a half old. Someone, at some point in the family's history, had made a deliberate choice to protect it, and to make sure whoever eventually found it understood there were limits on who should see it. That kind of deliberate care doesn't happen by accident. It happens when a family decides something is too important to throw away, but too uncomfortable to explain. Reyes did what any responsible collector would do. Rather than try to interpret the photograph himself, he brought it to a conservator who specialized in 19th-century photographic processes, a woman named Carol Ibsen, who had spent over 20 years restoring and authenticating Civil War-era tintypes and ambrotypes for regional museums. Ibsen's first task was simple: confirm the photograph was actually from the period it claimed to be from. Forgeries and later reproductions are common in the world of historical collectibles, and any serious claim about the image's contents would first require proving its authenticity. Using non-invasive imaging techniques, ultraviolet light magnification, and comparison against known chemical signatures of period-accurate photographic plates, Ibsen confirmed that the tintype was consistent with photographic processes used between 1861 and 1865. The metal backing, the emulsion layer, the characteristic silver halide degradation pattern, all of it lined up with genuine wartime photography. This wasn't a hoax. Not yet, anyway. Whatever this photograph showed, it had been taken during the war itself by someone standing in that clearing with a camera, at a moment in history now more than 160 years gone. Satisfied that the image was authentic, Ibsen turned her attention to the actual content of the photograph. On the surface, it appeared straightforward: 11 soldiers, standing in 2 loose rows, rifles down, facing the camera. Behind them, a dense tree line. To the left, a felled log. The lighting suggested late afternoon, the shadows long and slanted. It was a fairly typical wartime photograph, the kind of group portrait soldiers sometimes commissioned before a battle, in case it turned out to be their last. Nothing about the composition seemed unusual. Ibsen scanned the plate at extremely high resolution for her archive, as she did with every artifact she authenticated, and set the image aside for cataloging. It was almost 8 months later, during an unrelated digitization project, that a research assistant zoomed into the far corner of the scanned image and noticed something that didn't belong. The research assistant, a graduate student named Priya Anand who was helping catalog Ibsen's archive for a university digitization grant, was working through hundreds of scanned tintypes when she reached the Whitfield photograph. Her job was routine crop, tag, and label each image for the university's public history database. While cropping the edges of the photograph, Priya noticed something in the tree line behind the soldiers, a shape she initially assumed was a smudge or a flaw in the plate's emulsion. She zoomed in further to check whether it needed to be flagged for restoration. What she found, according to her later statement to Ibsen, was a human silhouette standing among the trees, roughly 40 to 50 feet behind the group of soldiers, partially obscured by branches and shadow. At first, this wasn't shocking on its own. Long exposure times in 19th century photography often produced ghostly artifacts. Anyone who moved during the several seconds the shutter stayed open would appear blurred, transparent, or partially erased from the final image. This is a well-documented and completely natural phenomenon, and it explains many of the so-called ghost photographs that circulate from this era. A passerby, an animal, even smoke drifting through the frame could all produce a similar effect. What made Priya pause wasn't that the figure was blurred. It was that the figure appeared to be looking directly at the camera, and, more strangely, seemed to be standing in a posture inconsistent with someone simply walking through the background. The shape had discernible shoulders, a suggestion of a head tilted at a specific angle, and most unsettling to those who examined it afterward, what appeared to be an outstretched arm, extended toward the group of soldiers in the foreground. Priya flagged the image for Ibsen's review, And Ibsen in turn brought in a colleague, a photoforensics analyst named Martin Kessler, who had previously consulted for museums attempting to identify anomalies in wartime photography. Before Kessler even entered the picture, though, Priya did something that university archivists are trained to do with any anomaly. She went back through the entire batch of scans from that collecting trip to see if the same kind of shadow artifact appeared anywhere else. Out of roughly 300 tintypes and ambrotypes processed that month, only the Whitfield photograph showed anything resembling a human-like shape in an unexpected part of the frame. Every other apparent anomaly in the batch turned out to be dust, plate corrosion, or a scratch in the metal backing, nothing that held together as a coherent shape under magnification. That mattered, because it ruled out the simplest explanation, a systemic flaw in how the scanning equipment or the plate itself was handling. If the anomaly had appeared randomly across dozens of images, the explanation would have been almost certainly technical. Instead, it appeared exactly once, in exactly one photograph, in exactly the spot where a person would have been standing had they been watching the group from a distance. Priya said later that this was the moment the story stopped feeling like a curiosity and started feeling like something worth taking seriously, not because she believed anything supernatural was involved, but because the anomaly behaved less like a defect and more like a subject. This is where the story starts to attract wider attention. Martin Kessler's job, broadly speaking, is to bring a scientific and skeptical eye to exactly this kind of mystery. He has spent his career debunking far more unexplained photographs than he's ever validated, and he approached the Whitfield tintype the same way he approaches everything, assuming a mundane explanation until the evidence rules one out. His first hypothesis was the most obvious one: motion blur from a person or animal moving through the tree line during the several-second exposure required by period cameras. To test this, Kessler used a technique called photogrammetric reconstruction, essentially mapping the geometry of the photograph to estimate distances, angles, and proportions within the frame. According to Kessler's later notes, shared publicly through a regional historical society's newsletter, the reconstructed proportions of the figure in the trees were consistent with an adult human form, not unusually tall, not unusually short, roughly in line with average height for the period. That alone wasn't alarming. What caught his attention was the positioning of what appeared to be the figure's raised arm, which, when measured against the rest of the frame, seemed to align almost precisely with the head of one specific soldier in the front row. Kessler was careful, in every public statement he made about the photograph, not to speculate wildly. He repeatedly emphasized that shadow, emulsion degradation, and the physical limitations of 19th-century photographic plates make it extremely difficult to say with certainty what any indistinct shape in a background actually represents. Pareidolia, the tendency of the human brain to find familiar patterns, especially faces and figures, in random visual noise, is a well-documented phenomenon, and Kessler acknowledged from the start that it could be at play here. And yet, when Ibsen, Kessler, and Priya sat down together to review the enhanced scans side by side, all three reported a similar reaction, an immediate visceral sense of unease that none of them could fully explain through professional detachment alone. Ibsen would later describe it simply as the kind of thing that makes the hair on your arms stand up before your brain has even decided why. It was at this point that the team decided the photograph deserved a wider, more rigorous examination, not because they believed anything supernatural was happening, but because the ambiguity itself had become historically interesting. Who was this figure? Was it a soldier who stepped out of formation? A civilian who wandered too close to a photography session? Or was it, as the note tucked with the photograph seemed to suggest, something that the Whitfield family had encountered and chosen never to speak of? Kessler's next step was to try to rule out camera defects entirely. 19th-century wet plate cameras were mechanically simple but chemically finicky, and it's not unusual for uneven application of the collodion solution used to coat the plate to create streaking, spotting, or cloudy patches in a developed image. Kessler compared the texture and density of the anomalous shape against the surrounding foliage in the tree line, looking for consistency in grain structure. The idea being that a chemical defect, would tend to sit on top of the image in a way that's texturally distinct from the photographic detail underneath it, while a photographed object would be embedded within the same layer of exposed detail as everything else in the frame. His conclusion, stated cautiously in his notes, was that the shape appeared to be part of the original exposure rather than a later chemical artifact. In plain terms, whatever it was, it had been in front of the camera when the shutter was open. It was not a smudge added after the fact. Something or someone had actually been standing in that tree line on the day the photograph was taken. That single technical finding is, in many ways, the crux of the entire story. It doesn't tell us who or what the figure was. It doesn't rule out a soldier, a stray civilian, or a trick of branches and shadow that merely resembles a human form closely enough to fool 3 trained professionals in a row. But it does close off the easiest explanation that this was simply a flaw in an old, fragile piece of metal and leaves the harder question open. To answer these questions, the team turned back to the rest of Box 47, the letters and papers that had been auctioned off alongside the photograph. Among the documents was a bundle of correspondence written by a Union soldier named Elias Whitfield to his sister back home. Elias's letters, spanning from early 1863 through the summer of 1864, painted the picture of an ordinary young soldier homesick, anxious, occasionally frightened, often trying to reassure his family that he was safe even when the tone of his letters suggested otherwise. Most of the letters described mundane details of camp life: food shortages, long marches, the boredom of waiting between engagements, but one letter, dated August of 1863, stood out to the research team immediately. In it, Elias described an incident that occurred while his unit was resting near a wooded area, following a skirmish that had resulted in several casualties. He wrote about a strange encounter during a lull in fighting figure some of the men reported seeing near the tree line, watching the camp from a distance, who vanished whenever anyone approached. Elias described his fellow soldiers as unsettled by the sighting, some of them refusing to venture near that section of woods afterward, even for firewood. He wrote, and this is a passage the research team quoted directly in their published findings, that the men had taken to calling the wooded area the watching line, and that more than one soldier claimed to have seen the same silhouette on separate occasions, always at dusk, always standing perfectly still. Elias himself was careful, even skeptical, in how he described the incident to his sister. He acknowledged that exhaustion, grief, and the constant proximity to death could easily explain soldiers imagining shapes in shadowy tree lines. War does strange things to the mind, he wrote, and men see what they're afraid of seeing. But he also admitted in the same letter that he had seen it himself, once, and that he had no interest in going back to find out what it was. The research team could not conclusively prove that the location described in Elias's letter was the same location depicted in the photograph. Geographic details in the letters were vague by necessity. Soldiers were often instructed not to disclose specific troop locations in personal correspondence for fear letters would be intercepted, but the timeline, the region, and the emotional tone of the letter lined up closely enough with the photograph's estimated origin that the connection felt, to everyone involved, difficult to dismiss as coincidence. Once Ibsen, Kessler, and Priya published a short summary of their findings through the Regional Historical Society, the story began to circulate more widely. Local newspapers picked it up first, followed by a handful of history-focused podcasts and online forums dedicated to Civil War-era artifacts and photography. With wider attention came, inevitably, more scrutiny and more skepticism.